Hello everyone, welcome to Eternal Basics. My name is Pojo, and today we're going to be building a carpet shuffle list, which is just one of my favorite decks ever. So we're going to be talking about consistency in deck building, and we're going to be trying to build a deck that can consistently pull off a specific combo. So we're finally moving into our first major combo deck. And we already have a basic shell for it in terms of Eternal Basics number 4, the blue shuffle list that we put together previously. Now, we talked a little bit about how this win condition goes off, but I don't believe that it actually succeeded in going off in the time that we played it during Eternal Basics number 4, and there was a specifically good reason for that, which is that if you have a number of different cards that you need to draw in a deck, you only really have a 4 in 75 chance of drawing them. It's actually a little bit higher than that, of course, because you draw 7 cards at the beginning of a game. But in general, you're not going to get all of the cards that you need in order unless you have multiple backups or different ways to make a combo happen. So that's something that we're going to talk about as we build out our combo. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the combo that we're talking about, what we're doing here is we have a static bolt, which is deal 1 damage, and it's always 2 because as soon as you draw it, the Fate ability increases the damage of static bolts in your hands and deck by 1. Now, what we do with this card is we put it on top of our deck with a card like Second Sight, we give it Echo with a card like Elysian Trailblazer, and then both copies increase the damage of all the static bolts in your deck and hand, and then you draw multiple copies using cards like Second Sight and other things to put it on top of your deck. Now, when we do that, the static bolts get pretty crazy. We just shuffle around on the carpet, we build up static. Eventually we have 3 or 4 bolts that deal around 8 or 9 damage, and for 6 power, we can just kill our opponent right there. That's the basic idea behind the combo of Carpet Shuffle. Now, we have a couple of different ways to execute on this plan, but in order to really build around this theme, we're going to have to switch into a time and primal deck. And so we're going to get into that right now. Alright, we already know the first card that we need for our list, since this is in fact a control deck and not a simple aggro deck, and we know that it's going to be a hybrid. We need, of course, Seek Power. This card we've already expressed the importance of in our previous video. It is an extremely good way to make sure that you don't get screwed in terms of mana, or in terms of power, or in terms of influence. And it also does something that we find very important, which is deck thinning. Now, the more that you thin out your deck, the higher a chance that you have to draw cards in your deck that are important to you. So if you can get rid of cards from your deck and make your deck smaller, then your deck becomes more consistent as a result. That isn't to say that you should express all of your power into thinning your deck, but there are some cards that will help you out while also making your deck smaller, and thus making it a little bit more reliable in terms of things that you want to draw. This is something that control decks in particular want to do a lot, because being able to draw consistent gas is very, very important to them, which is why control decks tend to run the card Secret Pages as well. Now, Secret Pages is essentially a more expensive Seek Power. We've already talked about its importance in control as well. It's very, very good for thinning all of the power out of your deck, and it also just allows you to basically get rid of, it basically allows you to fix your power such that you can get into the 8 costs. Now, we do have one 8 cost card that we want to run. You'll already have 1 copy of it, but we're going to cheat today, and we're going to craft 1 extra copy of it. If you don't want to do this, you can just add in an extra Elysian Trailblazer. That should be sufficient, but in general, I think the deck is significantly more consistent if we can put at least 2 channels in here, sometimes as many as 3 or 4. Now, with 8 drops that have very, very expensive influence costs, for the most part, you don't want to be running too many of these in your deck, and there's a very simple reason for that. It's that if you are drawing a handful of cards, and that handful of cards happens to have a lot of your 6s, 7s, and 8 drops, you're never going to get a chance to play those cards because your opponent is going to kill you before you actually get a chance. You need to be able to play other, smaller, simpler cards in order to build up to these cards, because these cards require an architecture or a framework to support them. And if you have them just sitting in your hand, then you're going to have to wait 8 turns to play anything valuable. Most good decks can kill you in that time, so in general you want to keep these numbers fairly light. But Channel the Tempest is going to be one of our most important cards And we're going to continually increase the efficiency of this card with a card called Excavate. Now, the first combo in this deck is Excavate and Channel the Tempest. And Excavate is a card that offers a unique disadvantage, which is that it moves a card from your void to the top of your deck, and you gain 2 health. So you spend this card, and you don't get a card back in return, and indeed, you skip your next draw because you're drawing a card that you've already played. Now, this is pretty important because it means that you don't get access to a wide variety of cards. However, if you manage to excavate a card like Channel the Tempest, then for the -1 card advantage that Excavate offers you, Channel the Tempest offers you another 3. And in addition, Channel the Tempest is by itself a way that you can win the game. So if you're playing a Channel the Tempest out, and then you Excavate and get another Channel the Tempest back, then you can keep doing this every turn until your opponent is dead, dead, dead. And that's really quite effective as far as combos go. In addition, Excavate is going to tie back into our central carpet shuffle theme. It's very, very good for putting cards on top of our deck, which allows us to give them Echo with Elysian Trailblazer. Elysian Trailblazer is, of course, a card that we want a lot of. We're going to put 3 of them in here. 4 of them is perfectly acceptable. And I'm just keeping that 4 slot open in case you don't want to craft that Channel the Tempest. But I think in this instance, it's well worth it to craft this rare. It's a very common way to win out in control decks. And if you really like control decks, I recommend putting in the dust for it. Okay, so Elysian Trailblazer gives the top spell of your deck Echo. This is one of our central combo pieces, and we're keeping it once again pretty light. We're trying not to put too many of this card in our deck, just so that we have access to a lot of the lower cost cards, so that we can easily keep the board clear and make sure that we are dealing with threats until we can actually get a chance to play Elysian Trailblazer. That being said, with only 3 Elysian Trailblazers in the deck, with only 2 Channel the Tempests, these are cards that win the game. So we need to make sure that we stay alive long enough to get to those cards. Now, this is an important aspect of control as well. Most control decks don't run that many victory conditions because they're trying to keep everything under control until such time as they draw just 1 or 2 cards that are going to absolutely win them the game. And this is the combo aspect of the control deck. So with that in mind, we of course have Lightning Storm. We've put that in before. We know that it's a very, very good card to put in. We have Permafrost as well. This is a simple, fast way to clear out your opponent's board. We're going to run 4 of those. The reason we run 4 of these instead of lower amounts of copies is because we want that consistency. We want to make sure that we are always playing these cards, and having 4 of a copy in your hand, it allows you to more often draw the card that you need. Even if you don't think that you need 4 Permafrosts to solve all of the problems, you're not necessarily going to draw just 1 Permafrost if you put it in your deck, so keep that in mind. Most singletons are things that solve very, very specific problems, and the only reason that you should ever run a one of something in your deck is if you have a specific way to search for it, or if it is essentially a win condition for your deck that you are absolutely going to draw or just succeed. So like if you have a specific way to set up that win condition, that helps a lot. All right, so let's see here. What else do we want to clear out the board? Well, of course we need Static Bolts. Static Bolt is very, very good for removal, but it's also the win condition for our deck, as we've talked about previously. In addition, we aren't really running too much else that's going to put this together. I think that should be enough for the moment. Yeah, that looks pretty good. We will run one of a particular solution called Decay. Now, this card is very, very good for getting rid of enemy attachments. It solves a particular problem that the other cards in our deck aren't solving for, and that is very, very important for us in terms of getting rid of cards that are really, really creating issues. Okay, so that's the basic framework of the deck, and these are all of the cards that we absolutely want to play. Now we need ways to actually get to those cards and make sure that the deck is reliably producing. Now, we've already got ways to thin out the number of power in the deck, but we're also going to add some cards that cantrip with themselves or draw new cards, thus making it more likely for us to get to these particular cards. First off, we're going to include 2 Levitates. This card gives a unit flying for a turn and allows us to draw a card. It's very good for popping Aegises. It's not usually used on our own units to give them flying, although it certainly can be if we're running a deck that actually runs units. But you'll notice that the only unit in the deck so far is Elysian Trailblazer. Now, Levitate we can run as many of 4 of, and if we run into a lot of Rakano decks, or decks with a lot of Aegises, then that's a reason to run Levitate. But for the moment, I think we only need 2, and this will effectively decrease the size of our deck by 2, because now whenever we draw this card, we just pay 1 and we draw a new one, and we're totally fine. So this is also just a good way to get rid of Aegises, and everything about that is pretty good for us, so that thins out the list a little bit. We'll include 2 Islands Favors. Once again, this just thins out the power in our deck a little bit more. It's fairly relevant for getting some stuff done, and it's also, the Aegis can be very, very useful. Now, because the Aegis effect does not stack, and because we don't always need a personal Aegis, this is a reason why we might want to run only 2 of Island's Favor. We don't know if this card is going to be useful to us all of the time, but we do know that we want at least 1 Aegis, and therefore, like, this is a reason that we might only want to run 2. Having 2, of course, gives us a higher chance of getting it than drawing 1, and with the amount of seeking power we have in here, this is going to go a lot of different ways to thin out our deck. Island's Favor is a pretty solid card for us. We're pretty happy to have it just at 2. So, we have different numbers here in terms of what we want to run, and that's based on how often we want to see it in our deck. Like, we really like Elysian Trailblazers, but we only really want to see them later in the game when we're around 6 or 7 power and we're actually able to pull off our combo. Earlier in the game, we don't really want to play this card down, so we're only running about 3 of them. Channel the Tempest is very, very similar. We don't want to see this card in our opening hands at all, but we really want to see it later in the game. As such, we're running only around 2 on the list. But everything else, these cards, the cards that solve problems, the cards that actively interact with the board, all of this stuff is the way that we are actually like winning the game. So we're running copies as high as 4. And it's pretty important to try to run 4 copies of most things in your deck, because if the card that you are picking is, in your opinion, the best card for your deck, why wouldn't you want the most number of them that you can get? Why wouldn't you want the highest chance to draw that card? So that's why we run 4 ofs in decks as opposed to running decks that are just collections of fun things with lots of little 1 ofs. It's because we have a particular plan. We know what the best cards for that plan are, and we want to have the best chance of drawing them. And that's the level of consistency that we are absolutely looking for in the deck. All right, we've got a few more spaces to fill out. Let me just figure out what it is that I've got here. I have it all put together. Well, of course, we need Second Sight. So Second Sight is, of course, our combo piece. We've talked about why it's important previously. That Echo ability is just extremely relevant, and we want it to be in our deck. Second Sight also interacts well with secret pages. That's a lot of fun. Pretty effective stuff. We talked a little bit about why Push Onward is a good card, and it's a very good card in Control. Today we're going to be adding 4 of them. This card not only allows us to cantrip and draw a new card, but it also reduces the cost, and it allows us to get a little bit more choice into what cards we are picking. So this is really useful for picking a particular combo piece out of our deck. It's a small, simple, effective tutor, similar to Celestial Omen, which we've talked about before, and is a very strong card in this deck as a 1 or 2 of, but we're not going to craft it. It's a little expensive, and overall I don't think we're going to need it. Push Onward, however, is a smaller version of that effect that's going to be very, very useful for us, so we'll put that in as well. And of course, simple card draw, Wisdom of the Elders and Ancient Lore, both of which draw us 2 cards. And having access to both of them in these 2 colors is part of why this is such a strong control list. So the extra card draw gives us, of course, as we've talked about before, a lot of extra options in our hand. It also makes it much easier for us to get to our combo pieces. Now, if we look at this deck, and we are pretty much finished with this deck, we can notice that what we have here is just a couple of cards that are our ways to win the game. We have Trailblazer, Tempest, Second Sight, Static Bolt, Excavate, and that's pretty much it. Everything else here has 2 basic strategies going on. One, it's trying to delay our opponent so that our opponent doesn't get to kill us before we have time to draw our combo pieces. Or two, it's trying to effectively get us to our combo pieces by reducing the size of our deck, by drawing through our deck, and basically just by making everything more reliable and consistent. We are just trying to significantly decrease the effective size of this deck by removing as much stuff from it as possible until we have a simple and basic plan that is always executed whenever we want it to be executed. A brief cut here because we accidentally deleted the deck, but now we have it put back together. And the last thing, of course, that we need to add is the power. We put in 25 power, we have 4 Seats of Wisdoms, and with Secret Pages, Islands, Favor, and Seek power, we now have effectively even more than that. And that's really, really quite important because control decks that have high requirements, Elysian Trailblazer and Excavate is around a 6 cost combo, Channel the Tempest is 8 cost, which is about as expensive as cards can get. There's only a couple of cards that cost 10, and very, very few that cost 9. These cards are really, really hard to play unless we support that with over 25 power. We've talked a lot about why it is that we need to do that and why we want 29 to 30, if not more than that. When we built the Basics Shuffle list, the deck automatically filled 18 power in for us, which expanded the size of our deck beyond 75 cards. And this is a pretty important concept that I want people to understand. Whenever we build decks, we try to build them at 75 cards or less if possible, which it is of course not. So we want them to be the absolute minimum size required to complete our plan. The reason for that is the same reason that we're trying to shrink our deck right now. It's that if we have indeed the most powerful cards for our particular plan being accessed, then we want to have the highest chance to draw those cards. It can be hard to evaluate cards and decide which one is the strongest and which one is the most important to that deck, but if you don't make that decision, then any of the extra cards that you include are going to be weaker because you have less of a chance to draw them when you actually need them. So this is the reason why we turn off advanced deck building in the first place, because we want to make sure that our deck is in fact including the appropriate amount of power and that we aren't exceeding that amount of 75 cards. And you can go to 76. 76 is usually fine. There are some reasons why you might want to include one extra card, but usually do not go higher than that. Try to stay at 75. It's a really, really good practice to build all of your decks to be the minimum required size, and not go for that 250 card deck achievement unless you're just funning around. Alright, so that about wraps that up. Let's go into a game and see if we can execute on our strategy. Alright, as we're recording this, it is the end of the month. We've just made it up to Master, so most of the players that we are going to be playing against are also going to be Masters. This is Chapman, actually. He's a writer for NewmontGaming.com. He's a pretty excellent Eternal card strategist. I have faith in Carpet Shuffle. Let's see if we can get it done, shall we? Yeah, Master 41 last month. Alright, so anyways, we've got Primal Sigil and Time Sigil. Now, because of the Seek power, this hand was actually keepable. We drew a Seek power and a Secret Pages. We have Islands Favor in here as well. We have a lot of things that are really, really going to help us out as far as keeping to our particular setup. Now, we want to think about what cards we're going to draw. And on 3, the card that we can draw is Wisdom of the Elders. So we want to have 2 blue influence for that. We're going to draw that sigil first, and we'll fix for the rest of the power later. My opponent is playing a Felm deck. Felm decks are pretty tricky against control right now due to the power of Champion of Cunning. There's very little that a control deck can do about Champion of Cunning. You can run cards like Rain of Frogs and a couple of other options that'll maybe give you a little bit better options, but overall there's not too much that we can run. We're going to Islands Favor to protect ourselves from a possible Rain of Frogs. The other option was to play a Time Sigil I actually should have played a Time Sigil to make it more likely that I could play Ancient Lore on 4, but I think either way I should be able to get that done, so we'll be okay. Now my opponent is also running something fairly control-like, as you can see by his push onwards there. I can use Second Sight to echo my secret pages and increase the amount of power that I am drawing, but I think I'd rather thin out my deck and increase my chances of drawing something effective against this deck. We'll just go ahead and do that. Let's see what we've got. Seat of Cunning. All right, looks pretty simple. Start our turn up, and now we have enough power to cast Ancient Lore. Since this is a fast spell, we have to cast it at the beginning of our turn. It's one of the disadvantages of Ancient Lore, but overall the card advantage should help us dramatically. My opponent plays Steward of the Past. Unfortunately, the effect of Steward of the Past does in fact pop our Aegis. We don't actually care about Steward of the Past all that much, so it's a little bit sad that it popped our Aegis, but at least our graveyard is protected, or our Void is protected from all of those units that we don't have getting silenced. Alright, we have a Static Bolt, so that's going to be pretty effective. I'm going to Second Sight to draw and put the Static Bolt on top. And I got a Wisdom of the Elders, but I can't play it right now. Since we don't need to play anything reactive right now, we're just going to Secret Pages again. And keep on thinning out our deck, making it more likely to draw the rest of those combo pieces. Now, Static Bolt will need to be in our Void for the Excavate and Elysian Trailblazer combo to work. So let's draw our cards first. Since we have power to play additional cards, it's better to draw our cards right now than to do it at the end of the turn, because we want to see if we can find something else to play, like for example that Push Onwards. Push Onwards, we'll look at the top 3 cards of our deck. This is pretty likely to catch us another one of our combo pieces. There's a Static Bolt right there. That's pretty good, but the Channel the Tempest for 7 is even more exciting, so I think we're going to opt for that. And what do you know? We have a combo. We have Channel the Tempest and 2 Excavates. That should be almost enough to kill our opponent straight away. He plays a second Steward of the Past. We can Permafrost that, which will help us out if a Champion of Cunning does in fact come down. But since I've got a Channel the Tempest at 7, it would be pretty foolish not to use it. We'll go ahead and shoot him for, I believe, 12. This should draw to our maximum amount of cards in hand. And our Echo cards help us out here, because they increase the effective number of cards that we have in our hand. This is yet another small, simple synergy that happens to work with our deck very well. Alright, so we end our turn here. And we'll have to discard some stuff. Secret Pages seems unlikely to be helpful here. I think I'll just toss 1 or 2 of them, and maybe a Power as well. Alright, we're looking pretty good. We have double Lightning Storms plus Static Bolt to deal with any major problems, which includes that Champion of Cunning. And indeed, I believe we'll just go ahead and get rid of those now. And I believe I'm going to Permafrost that Steward of the Past. And we'll Static Bolt his face. Will we Static Bolt his face? So, Channel the Tempest costs 7. Which means that if we play it... Yeah, no, it's actually better to wait. We'll Excavate Channel the Tempest. Channel the Tempest will get an extra point of damage because we didn't use that Static Bolt. And then we will be able to more effectively deal with our opponent then. Now we take 5 damage from Champion of Cunning, but we've managed to keep his board under control, so Champion of Cunning is not as threatening to us. We Excavate Channel the Tempest here, and it comes back up. We now get to Channel the Tempest him again. And we have our Static Bolts. This is not quite enough to win the game, so we'll have to Permafrost that Champion of Cunning there. But we have him now on the next turn, provided he doesn't find a way to deal 18 damage to us in a single turn. And fortunately, Party Hour has been nerfed, so even with 3 Champion of Cunnings, we should be able to pull this out. We'll go ahead and Excavate again. and my opponent, seeing the Channel the Tempest coming, happens to forfeit. And there you go. This worked out pretty well. Let's go ahead and go to the postmortem. Okay, one last simple rule that I want to note here is that every part of our deck here has multiple backup ways of being executed. We have our basic way of finishing the game through Channel the Tempest, but we also finish the game through Static Bolt and Excavate, through Elysian Trailblazer getting us enough card advantage to simply weigh down on our opponent. We have other ways to push for an actual victory. We have a way of removing threats from the board with Lightning Storm, and we also back that up with Permafrost. We back that up with removal such as Static Bolt. Even our finishers are a way to get rid of units that can threaten us and make sure that we have the longevity to accomplish our goals, even if we aren't able to play out the channel immediately to just push for the win. When we're trying to make our deck smaller, we have so many different ways that we accomplish this. Not only do we do it by seeking power with secret pages and islands, with other things like that, but we also use card draw. We use cards like Push Onwards to make our deck even more effectively small. We use cantrips like Levitate. There are a lot of different ways that we accomplish every particular goal of this deck. And indeed, there are only 4, maybe 3 or 4 things that we want this deck to do. We want it to win the game. We want it to remove our opponent's creatures so that we can win the game. We want it to thin out the deck so we can get access to the things that are most important to us. And beyond that, we just want to make a basic combo happen with Excavate and Elysian Trailblazer. This is a really, really simple idea, and we've labored to make it so that it can be executed as frequently and as consistently as possible. And my hope for when these videos are finished, or even while you're watching these videos, is that when you get an idea for a deck, you'll have all of the basic rules and basic ideas necessary to just go and build that thing and make it in a way that functions, and make it in a way that functions really, really effectively, so that as soon as you have that idea, as soon as you see those cards that you want to play, you can figure out a way to play them such that you will most often get that feeling of excitement and that feeling of wonder that you get from just essentially playing out the cards that you want to play and winning a game with them. So yeah, if this deck excites you, we'll be doing a deck tech on it, and you can take a closer look at that soon. I believe that will be up. I'll put a link as soon as it is up right below. And also, as far as decks go, if you have an idea, go build it. Make sure that it's small and simple. Make sure that it has the power framework necessary to play it out, and figure out ways to build it out so that it consistently accomplishes what you want to accomplish. So yeah, go forth and conquer. We'll be back with more Eternal Basics videos soon. Thank you guys so much for watching. Feel free to like or subscribe, and let me know how I did in the comments. This was a lot of fun, of course, and I will see you next time. Have a great night, guys.